There is a plant that for centuries fed entire families in the mountains of the Americas, not with a handful of dry beans that need to soak overnight, not with a 2-month harvest that forces you to store and calculate and pray it lasts until the next season, but with enormous fleshy pods, loaded with grains as large as a child's fist, available almost year-round, from a tree you planted once that kept producing while your children grew up, while your grandchildren learned to walk, while the world around you changed without stopping. The common bean produces protein for 2 or 3 months a year, then it dies. You pull it up, prepare the soil, buy new seeds, start over, year after year, the same cycle, the same dependence, the same loop someone designed so you could never escape it. This plant produces superior plant protein for 10-11 months a year from a single tree. That you didn't replant, that you didn't buy twice, that simply kept growing while you harvested. And then it disappeared. Not from the forests, not from the remote mountains, it disappeared from markets, from nurseries, from collective memory. In less than 30 years, it went from being a staple food in Andean and tropical communities to being a rarity that most people under 50 have never seen, never tasted, never heard named. Why? That is exactly the question I'm going to answer today. But before I give you the name, I need you to understand something, because if I just tell you the name and you don't understand what happened, you'll go looking for it at the nearest nursery and you won't find it. And you'll think I exaggerated, that I made it up. I made nothing up. They buried it. And now you're going to understand exactly how they did it and why. If you're over 50, you've probably seen this plant without knowing its name. Maybe in the yard of a relative in the countryside, maybe at a village market that no longer exists, maybe in that blurry childhood memory where there's an enormous tree, pods hanging like green lanterns, and the smell of something cooking that you can't name but would recognize instantly. If you remember something like that, this message is for you, and if you never saw it too, because you still have time to know it, to plant it, to recover what was taken from us without anyone asking our permission. Welcome. And today we're going to talk about the plant that feeds more than the bean, that the system banned without banning it, and that your grandmother probably knew better than any modern agronomist. There's something important I want to tell you from the start. You don't need a large estate. You don't need farming experience. You don't need special tools or industrial formula fertilizers. This plant grew for centuries in small yards, on steep hillsides, in soils that no one considered good for anything. It was cultivated by people who had never read a single agronomy textbook, but who understood something fundamental that the modern system decided to make us forget. That nature, when you allow it to, produces permanent abundance, not seasons, not cycles of buying and rebuying, abundance that lasts decades from a single decision to plant. And here's where it gets interesting. In the 40s and 50s, agricultural records from Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Venezuela mentioned this plant regularly. Field advisors recommended it to families who needed accessible protein without depending on the market. Grandparents knew it by various names depending on the region. It was common. It was normal. It was part of the landscape of rural yards, just like the orange tree or the avocado. Today, if you walk through those same towns and ask at the nurseries, 9 out of 10 people under 40 will look at you without understanding what you're talking about. The knowledge didn't just evaporate. Someone made sure not to pass it on. Someone decided this plant didn't fit the new model, and that model had a name: industrial agriculture, seeds that die, customers who come back, dependence that calls itself modernity. The thing is, the disappearance of this plant was not an accident or a collective forgetting. It was the result of several pressures that came together at the same time, in the same decades, and had the same effect, eliminating from the market and from popular consciousness any plant that made people too independent to be profitable. The seed companies that began to dominate Latin American farming in the 60s and 70s had no interest in promoting perennial leguminous trees that a family could plant once and harvest for 30 years. There's no business in that. There's no captive customer in that. The supermarkets and distribution chains that began replacing village markets needed standardized packaged products with clear expiration dates and controlled supply chains. A plant that produces continuously, whose harvest doesn't all come in the same month, that doesn't lend itself to industrial volume transport, that every family can have in their own yard. That plant is the perfect enemy of the modern distribution model. They didn't ban it with a law. They didn't sign a decree. They simply stopped mentioning it. They stopped selling its seeds. They stopped teaching it in agronomy schools, and in one generation, it went from common to forgotten. Meanwhile, the annual bean fit perfectly into that new world. It's harvested all at once, dried, packaged, transported, sold in bags with logos and barcodes, bought every month. The cycle repeats. The bean isn't a bad food, to be clear. The problem isn't the bean. The problem is that they convinced us the annual bean was the only option, when there was a perennial alternative that was more productive, richer in protein, easier to grow at small scale, that produced without needing replanting, without needing to buy new seeds every season, without needing to depend on anyone. That alternative existed. It still exists, though hidden, and today you're going to meet it. If you want this knowledge that was taken from us to stay alive, subscribe and hit the bell. Because what's coming isn't in nursery catalogues. It lives in the memory of those who still know. And today, we're going to recover it together. I have a very clear memory, though the details blend a little with time the way all childhood things do. It was at a relative's house in the countryside. I think I was about 8 or 9 years old, maybe 10. The yard was dirt, uneven, with that floor that's never completely flat in rural yards, where roots push up through the soil and stones appear on their own after rain. And there was a tree. A tree that to me was enormous, though now I understand it was probably no more than 4 or 5 meters tall. But when you're 9 and standing next to something that towers over you several times, everything becomes monumental. What I remember most isn't the size, it's the weight of the pods. They hung from the branches as if the tree were tired of carrying so much. Long green pods, some with that tone that starts to yellow when they're ready, 20-25 centimeters, and inside the grains. Grains that looked like no bean I had ever seen before. Large, smooth, a greenish cream color that changed when you cooked them. I remember asking what it was, and someone told me the name with the casualness of someone naming something as everyday as water or bread, as if it were obvious that everyone should know it. They cooked some that afternoon. I don't know exactly how they prepared them, whether they roasted or boiled them first. I don't remember that detail anymore. But I do remember the flavor. Soft, dense, with a texture that filled your mouth in a way different from the black bean or red bean I ate at home. More like something between a potato and a chestnut, but with that vegetable depth that leaves you genuinely satisfied, not the kind of satisfaction that lasts an hour and then hunger comes back, the kind that stays. What impressed me most, though I didn't have words to fully understand it at the time, was that no one seemed to have planted it recently. It was an old tree. It had been there long before I was born, and it kept producing, without anyone replanting it, without anyone doing much beyond collecting what it gave. It was simply there, bearing pods season after season, as if that were the most natural thing in the world, because for that family it was. Many years passed before I thought about that tree again. Decades, really. City life erases those childhood memories with brutal efficiency. But at some point, already an adult, I became interested in perennial food plants, in alternatives to annual crops, in recovering knowledge that the modern system had been leaving behind. And one day, reviewing old documents on Andean agriculture, a description appeared that stopped me cold. Large pods, grains the size of a small egg, perennial tree of mountain zones, protein comparable or superior to the common bean. A staple food in indigenous and peasant communities of Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Venezuela. Known by multiple names depending on the region, chachafruto, balú, sachaporoto, paique, frijol de palo. There it was. The tree from the yard of my childhood had a name, and it had a history, and it had a very concrete reason why it had disappeared from markets, from nurseries, from everyday conversation about food. A reason that had nothing to do with the plant stopping to work, and everything to do with the fact that it worked too well for certain interests. I started looking for more, and what I found confirmed something I already sensed. I wasn't the only one who remembered this tree without being able to name it. There's an entire generation, those of us over 50, that carries in some corner of memory the image of a plant like this, a tree that never stopped, pods that appeared without anyone doing too much, a food that was there, available, generous, asking almost nothing in return, and that one day, without announcement or explanation, simply stopped appearing in nurseries, in markets, in conversations. It turns out that the chachafruto, as this plant is known in much of Colombia and Ecuador, was for centuries one of the most important protein foods in Andean communities. It wasn't a marginal crop or a botanical curiosity. It was real food, everyday food, food that was shared with neighbors, cooked in multiple ways, preserved, that fed entire families during the months when other crops weren't producing. It was, in the most precise sense of the word, a nutritional pillar. And notice how revealing this is. In the archives of some Latin American agricultural institutions, mentions of chachafruto still appear in documents from the mid-20th century, recommending it precisely for its qualities as an accessible protein source for low-income rural communities. It wasn't unknown to the experts. It was known, valued, documented, and yet it disappeared. That doesn't happen by accident. That happens when the system finds something inconvenient. Because the chachafruto has a characteristic that makes it incompatible with the modern agro-industrial model. Once you plant it, and it establishes itself, which takes 2 or 3 years, you simply don't need to go back to the nursery. You don't need to buy seeds. You don't need to depend on any supply chain. The tree produces, you harvest, and that repeats for 20, 25, 30 years. A customer who plants a chachafruto in their yard is a customer who stops buying packaged beans for 3 decades. Multiply that by thousands of families, and you understand why no one had any interest in continuing to promote this plant when the industrial model began to dominate Latin American agriculture. There is a growing community of people rediscovering this knowledge. People who remember, who search, who ask the remaining grandparents, who rescue seeds from old trees before they disappear. You're not alone in this. Thousands of people over 50 are recovering plants like this one, with the conviction of someone who understands that what was taken from us had a value that the modern market never knew how or wanted to recognize. That tree in the yard of my childhood was just one. But there are more plants like it hidden in the same story. Stay, because what comes next, I'm going to reveal everything about chachafruto, why it surpasses the bean, what makes it extraordinary, how to grow it today, and why the system did everything possible to make you forget it existed. If you ever saw a tree like this, if your grandmother or grandfather told you about a plant with large pods that never stop producing, leave it in the comments. I need to know that this memory hasn't been entirely lost. And if you want to recover this knowledge for your own yard, subscribe. Because now comes the part the system least wants you to know. The chachafruto, Erythrina edulis, also known as balu in some regions of Colombia, as sachaporoto in Ecuador, as paique in Peru, as frijol de palo in Venezuela, and parts of Central America. A perennial leguminous tree of the tropical and subtropical Andes that can reach between 4 and 8 meters in height, with a robust trunk, large, deep green leaves, intense red flowers that appear before the pods and that transform the tree, during the weeks of flowering, into something that looks like it belongs to another world. A tree that doesn't ask permission to be beautiful and doesn't ask permission to be productive. The pods are the first thing that strikes you when you see it loaded. They can measure between 20 and 40 centimeters long. They hang in clusters, heavy, with that slightly velvety texture of young legumes. Inside, the grains. That's where the chachafruto breaks every comparative framework with the common bean. Each grain can measure between 3 and 8 centimeters. These aren't the small, hard grains we know from the dried beans we buy in bags. They're large, soft when fresh, light green or cream-colored depending on the stage of maturity, with a texture after cooking that's closer to potato or tender corn than to traditional beans. They're eaten boiled, roasted, in soups, in purees, dried, and ground into flour. The culinary versatility of chachafruto was, and still is in the few communities that have kept it alive, extraordinary. But let's return to what I was telling you, because the numbers are where this story becomes impossible to ignore. A well-established adult chachafruto tree can produce between 50 and 120 kilograms of pods per harvest season. In suitable climates, with rainfall distributed throughout the year, it can yield 2 harvest seasons annually. Compare that with the common bean, A bean plant produces between 100 and 200 grams of dry grain per plant. To get 1 kilogram of dry beans, you need between 5 and 10 plants, which take up space, which need to be replanted every year, which require supports or stakes, which are vulnerable to dozens of pests and diseases. A single chachafruto tree, in the space of one tree, produces what would require hundreds of annual bean plants, and it does so year after year, without anyone replanting, without anyone buying new seeds, without the cycle of dependence ever getting a chance to take hold. Do you know what's most extraordinary of all? The protein content. The common dry bean has approximately 21 to 23% protein. Fresh chachafruto has between 10 and 16% protein in the grain, which may sound lower, but one must consider that the common bean is consumed dry, with all its water removed, while chachafruto is consumed fresh or semi-dried. When compared on an equivalent dry weight basis, chachafruto is perfectly comparable in protein to the bean, with the additional advantage of noticeably superior digestibility. The common bean has anti-nutritional factors, substances that interfere with the absorption of proteins and minerals that require prolonged soaking and long cooking to reduce. Chachafruto has very low levels of these factors. It cooks faster, is digested more easily, and causes fewer of the intestinal discomforts that many people associate with frequent legume consumption. In addition to protein, chachafruto provides calcium, phosphorus, iron, B-complex vitamins, and an amino acid profile that makes it a complete food for communities that depend on plant-based nutrition. For centuries, in the Andean mountains where access to animal protein was limited or seasonal, chachafruto was exactly what those communities needed: a perennial protein source, accessible, growable in one's own yard, without needing a market or a middleman. And here is the pattern that repeats itself whenever you research plants like this one. Chachafruto didn't disappear from everywhere. It's still grown in rural communities in Nariño and Antioquia in Colombia. It still appears in peasant markets in the Ecuadorian highlands. There are still families in Andean valleys of Peru that maintain old trees they care for as if they were part of the family, because in a sense they are. The plant didn't fail. The plant never stopped working. What failed, what was deliberately broken, was the channel through which knowledge about this plant reached new generations. Let me explain it another way, because this is important to understand clearly. When industrial agriculture accelerated in Latin America during the 60s and 70s, the model that was imposed had very specific characteristics: annual crops, improved seeds that must be purchased each season, chemical inputs, harvests concentrated in short periods to facilitate transport and distribution. That entire model depended on farmers and later urban consumers adopting a relationship of dependence with the market. They needed to buy seeds. They needed to buy inputs. They needed to buy food they no longer produced themselves. Chachafruto was the perfect enemy of that model, not because anyone signed a decree against it, not because there was a conspiracy with names attached, but simply because it didn't fit. Seed companies couldn't sell chachafruto seeds to someone who had a tree that produced its own seeds for 30 years. Supermarkets couldn't handle a product whose harvest occurred continuously and staggered across millions of domestic yards. The modern agricultural advisory system, oriented toward industrial productivity and export, had no interest in recommending a tree that solved a family's nutritional needs definitively and permanently. A customer who solves their protein problem for the next 3 decades isn't a customer. They're a closed account. So what happened wasn't a forgetting. It was a systematic silence. Agricultural advisors stopped mentioning it. Nurseries stopped propagating it. Rural schools stopped teaching it. And in the span of 1 or 2 generations, knowledge that had taken centuries to build, the accumulated understanding of entire communities about how to grow, harvest, prepare and preserve chachafruto began dissolving until it nearly disappeared. But there's something more in this story that I think is essential to name. Chachafruto doesn't only feed people, it also feeds the soil. Like all legumes, its roots have the ability to fix atmospheric nitrogen in the soil, which means a chachafruto tree actively improves the fertility of the land where it grows. In traditional agroforestry systems, it was planted alongside other crops precisely for this reason. The tree enriched the soil while producing food. It was, in the language we would use today, an essential component of a regenerative agricultural system. It didn't exhaust the land, it improved it. And that kind of knowledge, that deep understanding of how plants relate to each other and to the soil that sustains them, is exactly the kind of knowledge that industrial agriculture had no interest in preserving or transmitting. Here's something important. Chacha fruto also doesn't require perfect soils. It grows in mountain soils with good drainage between approximately 1,000 and 2,500 meters above sea level, though there are varieties that adapt to broader ranges. It tolerates moderate drought periods once established. It doesn't need chemical fertilizers, though it appreciates occasional compost. Its main enemies are hard frosts and prolonged soil waterlogging. Outside of those conditions, it's a remarkably resilient plant given how little it demands in exchange for how much it produces. The cultivation process begins with seed or with branch cuttings. Chacha fruto seeds have a good germination rate when fresh, and the plant in its first months grows with a speed that surprises. Under favorable conditions, it can reach 1.5 meters in the first year. The first production usually begins between the second and third year. Full production, that abundant harvest of heavy pods hanging in clusters, arrives in the 4th or 5th year and holds for decades. A decision to plant today is a decision to harvest quality plant protein for 30 years without making any significant investment again. For harvest, the ideal moment is when the pods have reached their full size, but before they begin drying on the tree. At that point, the grains inside are fresh, tender, with that texture that makes them so versatile in the kitchen. If you leave them too long on the tree, they begin to dry out, which is also not a problem because dried grains are also useful. They just require pre-soaking before cooking, similar to traditional dried beans. The versatility of Chacha fruto in this regard is one of its great advantages. You can harvest fresh for immediate consumption or let them dry for longer preservation. Both options are valid and useful. In the kitchen, fresh boiled Chacha fruto is the simplest starting point. 20 to 30 minutes in salted water, and you have a nutritious, flavorful food that can be eaten on its own, or incorporated into soups, stews, salads, or purees. In many Andean communities, it's prepared with hogao, with chili pepper, with herbs from the yard. It's mixed with other vegetables. It's used to thicken broths. Dried Chacha fruto flour, ground at home with a food processor or hand mill, can be added to breads, tortillas, and arepas, significantly increasing their protein content without greatly changing the flavor or texture of the base preparation. It is, in the most precise sense, an ingredient that multiplies the nutritional value of whatever you're already cooking. Want to know something interesting? Chacha fruto also has uses that go beyond human food. The leaves and tender branches are high-quality fodder for animals, especially cattle, goats, and pigs. On traditional farms, the tree served a dual function. It fed the family and it fed the animals. That ability to solve multiple needs from a single tree with a single planting decision was precisely what made it so valuable to the domestic rural economy, and precisely what made it so inconvenient for a system that prefers to sell separate solutions for each problem. Today, if you want to find Chacha fruto seeds or plants, the path is to search in nurseries specializing in native and ethnobotanical plants, at heirloom seed fairs organized in many Latin American cities, in seed exchange groups on social networks, or simply by asking at rural markets in Andean zones where the fresh pod is still sold. The plant didn't disappear from the world. It still exists. What disappeared was the mass commercial channel that made it easily accessible, but whoever searches, finds. And today, with the seed exchange networks that are growing across Latin America, finding a Chacha fruto is more possible than at any point in the last 40 years. If you get a plant or some seeds, take cuttings. Propagate. Share with neighbors, with family, with anyone who has a yard and wants to use it for something more than a decorative garden. Chacha fruto roots easily from cuttings, which means one tree can become dozens of trees in a few years, simply by cutting branches and sharing them. That was the way it spread for centuries in Andean communities, from yard to yard, from family to family, without a nursery, without a catalogue, without a price tag. And it can spread that way again. Every person who plants a chachafruto and harvests for 20 years stops buying processed plant protein for 2 decades. That's a lost customer for the system. Multiply that by 1,000 families, by 10,000, and you start to understand why these plants were buried with such care and such silence. They work too well. They make people too independent. They solve too many problems at once. And the modern food system was not designed to solve problems definitively. It was designed to manage them, to keep them active, so that you keep needing to buy the solution every month, every season, every year. Remember that enormous tree in the yard of my childhood, those pods hanging like green lanterns, that dense and soft flavor you couldn't find in any supermarket bean. Now you know its name. Now you know why it almost disappeared. Now you know it wasn't a forgetting but a calculated silence, a systematic omission for the benefit of those who needed you to keep depending on the annual cycle of buying and rebuying. And now you know you can still plant it, that it still exists. That the memory you carried without being able to name it has real roots in real soil, bearing real pods in the few yards where someone had the good judgment or good fortune not to abandon it. At the start I told you this plant feeds more than the bean. Now you know exactly in what sense. More protein per tree, more months of production per year, more years of harvest from a single planting, more independence from the market, more soil richness instead of exhausting it, more uses in the kitchen, more history behind every pod. It didn't disappear because it failed. It disappeared because it worked too well for those who wanted to sell you beans in a bag every month. The best time to plant was 20 years ago. The second best time is today. Every month that passes without a chachafruto in your yard is one more month in the cycle the system designed for you. But that's a decision you can change right now. With a seed, with a cutting, with a conversation with someone who still has one of those old trees that no one ever replanted because no one ever needed to. Together we are recovering what was taken from us, not with empty outrage but with soil on our hands and seeds in our pockets. That's what the system didn't account for, that memory doesn't die entirely as long as there is someone willing to search, to name, to plant. If you know someone who remembers a tree like this, who carries in some corner of their memory those enormous pods and that flavor you can't find in any supermarket, share this urgently. Help me get this knowledge into the hands that can still plant it, because chachafruto doesn't need you to save it. It only needs you to remember it. If you want to discover more plants the system buried because they worked too well, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. Like this video if it moved you. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from, whether you remember this tree, whether you've ever seen it, whether you have it in your yard, or whether you're looking for it. I need to know that this memory is waking up, that it's coming back, that it's reaching the hands of those who truly cultivate,